Her sister sold family secrets to the enemy, including the hospital where Valentina would give birth. Chiara wasn't finished after stealing Enzo. She wanted revenge. She fed the Moretti family shipping routes, warehouse locations, weaknesses, and the one piece of information that could start a blood war. The baby's due date. Suddenly, Valentina's unborn child wasn't just an heir. The baby became a leverage, and Enzo Carbone was ready to burn the city down to protect them. Freeze the frame right here. It is 2 a.m, and the massive stone house breathes with that suffocating, heavy quiet that always falls right before a life is completely ruined. Today, you and I are going to watch Valentina's entire world shatter. She is just a restless, newly pregnant wife walking down a freezing marble hallway for a glass of water. Then a sound stops her dead. A soft, breathless laugh leaking from her husband's private study. She looks through the narrow crack in the heavy oak door, and there it is. Enzo, the untouchable boss of the underworld, is gently running his hands through her own sister's hair. Chiara has tattoos like he belongs to her, because the tragic truth of this life is that the people standing closest to us are usually the ones holding the sharpest knives. Watch how her trembling hand instinctively falls to protect her stomach. 8 weeks pregnant. The 2 people she loves most on this earth are casually dismantling her sanity. Just inches away behind a heavy wooden door, the long hallway instantly stretches into a dark, suffocating tunnel of total isolation. Her mind is screaming at her to kick the door open, to scream until her lungs bleed, to tear them apart with her bare hands, but she does absolutely nothing. She's entirely paralyzed by the sickening scale of the betrayal. She just stands frozen against the freezing plaster, forcing her eyes to watch the destruction of her own family. It is a harsh lesson we all learn eventually. Even when your soul shatters into a million pieces, the human body somehow forces you to keep standing. Let us take a closer look at the apex predator in his natural habitat. Enzo swore a sacred oath to Valentina exactly 3 years ago, yet here he is, brushing his knuckles against her sister's cheek, with a sickening tenderness he has starved his own wife of. Chiara leans into his hand with a familiar grace that proves this is a well-rehearsed dance. You can see the memories violently flashing behind Valentina's wide eyes. Every Sunday dinner. Clara smiling over the table while Enzo rested his hand on Valentina's thigh. She was never his leading lady. She was just the audience for their sick romance. Life has a cruel way of showing us the truth we ignored. We often only see what we desperately want to see, until the reality burns our eyes and leaves us completely blind. Consider the vicious timing of fate in this room. The doctors confirmed her pregnancy just 1 week ago, a tiny miracle after 2 years of crying in the dark while Enzo grew colder. Now the silence makes terrifying sense. Chiara's voice slips through the wooden crack, totally empty of any guilt. "You have to tell her," she whispers softly. Enzo mutters something too low to hear, but his heavy shoulders say enough. He slowly shakes his head, his muscles flexing as he pulls her own sister tight against his chest. In that exact fraction of a second, something deep inside Valentina quietly dies. Pathetic love she held on to just evaporates into the cold air. Because love does not always end in a fiery explosion. Sometimes, it simply freezes to death in the pitch black. Valentina slowly backs away into the shadows, pressing her shaking spine against the wall just to keep her legs from giving out. Her eyes are swimming in heavy tears, but she bites the inside of her cheek until she tastes warm copper. She absolutely refuses to give him the satisfaction of hearing her break. She moves down that dark hallway like a ghost. She floats up the grand staircase, walking blindly past the stern portraits of Enzo's ancestors and the door to the freshly painted nursery. Back in their cold bed, she just sits there, staring at the far wall as the clock ticks away. The sky outside bleeds from black to pale morning blue. She does not move. The hardest lesson of grief is realizing that silence is often the loudest scream a broken heart can ever make. Think back with me for a moment and look at the glaring warning signs she chose to ignore. The late nights Enzo casually blamed on syndicate business. The hushed phone calls in the kitchen, how Chiara suddenly started visiting every single day, playing the perfectly devoted sister. Valentina wrapped herself in a cozy blanket of denial, but now the cold air hits her bare skin. When the heavy bedroom door finally clicks open at 6 a.m, she stays perfectly rigid. She feels the heavy dip of the mattress. Enzo reaches out, casually brushing his fingers against her shoulder, and her entire body violently flinches. "You are awake early," he murmurs into the quiet room, smooth, guiltless. Denial is just a warm lie that eventually suffocates the truth right out of us. Notice the terrifying calm rolling off him. That is the chilling control of a man who orders executions and eats his dinner without his pulse rising a beat. "I just could not sleep," she whispers to the wall. He asks if the baby is keeping her awake, and the sickest part is that he sounds exactly like a caring husband. She nods her head, playing the role, because lying is the only shield she has left. But when his large hand slides over to rest on her stomach, her skin literally crawls. These are the exact same hands that were tangled in her sister's hair hours ago. "You need to get some rest," he tells her smoothly. "The truth is terrifying. True monsters do not hide in the dark alleys. They sleep right beside us, wearing the faces of those we trust with our lives." She can feel his dark eyes burning into the side of her head, spstring the fizzing lines of a tough posture. A man does not rule a criminal empire by ignoring shifts in a room. But Enzo possesses a fatal, blinding flaw: his own massive ego. He firmly believes his sweet, quiet wife is entirely too weak to see through his brilliant lies. "Is something wrong?" he asks, his voice dropping into the cold tone he uses for business. She slowly rolls over. In the gray morning light, she truly looks at him. The sharp jawline, the utterly empty eyes, the ink covering his skin. He built his life around family loyalty, only to completely destroy it by sleeping with her blood. It shows us all that arrogance is a heavy blindfold, preventing even the most powerful men from seeing their own doom. Valentina takes her shattered heart, locks it in a steel box, and throws away the key. "Nothing is wrong at all," she lies flawlessly. Enzo buys it instantly, completely fueled by his own arrogance, and climbs out of the bed. "I am going to be home late tonight. Do not wait up for me," he says, adjusting his expensive watch. She stares at those tattooed hands reaching for the brass door handle, and then she drops the bait. "Enzo?" she calls out. He stops. "Is Chiara coming over for family dinner this week?" Boom. Did you catch it? That microscopic twitch in his jaw. A woman running on pure adrenaline misses nothing. "I do not know," he replies. "Why?" She smiles a dead smile. The most dangerous weapon any woman can possess is a sweet smile that perfectly hides a broken spirit. His jaw tightens up just a fraction of an inch. "That sounds fine. Let me know what you decide." He walks out, leaving her sitting alone in a bedroom that suddenly feels like a cold crime scene. "Stick with me here, because you and I are about to watch a soft girl transform into a lethal weapon." The next few days are nothing but pure, agonizing survival. Valentina drifts through the massive estate like a shadow, playing the loving Mafia wife, while her soul hardens into solid rock. She smiles at the staff. She lets Enzo kiss her cheek without flinching. But behind those dead eyes, she is quietly gathering ammunition. She tracks his phone. She notes the locks on his study. Because grief does one of two things: it either destroys you completely, or it forges you into solid steel. 2 endless days later, Chiara struts into the house, looking like absolute perfection, her voice pitched high with fake sweetness. "You look so incredibly tired," Chiara purrs, tilting her head like a curious bird. Valentina just gives her a weak, hollow nod. Then the predator actually steps closer and violently squeezes Valentina's cold hand. "I worry about you being all alone in this massive house." Valentina quietly points out that the house is full of staff. "Maids are not blood," Chiara counters smoothly. If you look closely, you can see the absolute sadistic thrill dancing in Chiara's eyes. "Call me anytime," she insists. Valentina slowly pulls her hand free. A harsh truth of life is that betrayal wears the most beautiful masks, painting poison with the brush of sisterly love. "I mean it." Kiara pushes, leaning in closely like they are sharing a deep, sacred secret. Marriage can be so lonely when a man carries that much power. You need someone who actually understands what you are going through. That sick, twisted taunt just hangs in the heavy air between them like a drawn blade. Valentina searches her sister's pretty face, desperately looking for a single drop of guilt. But there is absolutely nothing. Just that same smug, arrogant smirk Kiara has worn since they were children stealing toys. She has always taken exactly what she wanted, and right now, she wants the king. "I really need to lie down," Valentina says flatly. You can never expect a real apology from someone who completely and utterly enjoys the exact pain they have caused you. Let us pause the frame right here, because you and I are about to witness the exact second a soul shatters and reshapes itself. "Send him my regards," Valentina whispers, her voice a cutting blade. The other woman stammers a weak defense, but for one agonizing beat, her fake smile crumbles. Valentina walks away, her heart violently pounding. She locks herself in the dimly lit bathroom, gripping the cold marble sink until her knuckles turn bone white. The mirror reflects a ghost-pale skin, hollow eyes, the tragic wreckage of a woman who believed in love. But watch her eyes closely as the shadows shift. The obedient wife is burning into ash, and something ruthless is waking up. Sometimes, the most devastating pain we endure is exactly what gives us the fierce strength to finally open our eyes. Let us look closer at this tragedy, unpacking it frame by frame. Try to imagine the most bitter poison a heart could ever swallow. Enzo, the man who swore to protect her, has been sharing a bed with her own sister. Valentina wraps a trembling hand over her rounded stomach, forming a desperate shield. This unborn child does not need a casualty. It requires a fierce protector. "I will not let them destroy us," she whispers into the suffocating darkness. She does not yet know if she will vanish into the night or burn his empire to the ground. But the rusted chains of her trauma have finally snapped. She refuses to be a mere spectator in her own ruin. The profound lesson here is that absolute heartbreak is often the only brutal cure for our willing blindness. Shift the camera to Enzo through the hardened eyes of his lieutenant, Marco. For 15 long years, Marco watched Boss order terrible things over coffee without a single flinch. He was cold, calculated, and totally untouchable. But today, the grand marble pillar has a fatal crack. Marco steps into the dim study to report a rival invasion, yet Enzo just stares blindly at his phone, mesmerized by his twisted affair. "Boss, did you hear me?" Marco asks, his voice thick with unease. Enzo drops the device and dismissively tells him to handle it. When Marco pushes back, Enzo violently snaps, surrendering his authority. Here is a truth about human nature. A true control freak never hands over the keys to his kingdom, unless he is already drowning in his own toxic poison. The wolves are scratching at the gates, yet the alpha is sound asleep. Marco tests the waters, asking if everything is peaceful at home. Enzo instantly bristles, tensing as he barks that his private life is off limits. Marco gently reminds him that a clouded mind is a lethal threat. Enzo lowers his voice into that terrifying register that makes grown men freeze, ordering his lieutenant to step back. Marco bows his head, playing the obedient soldier, but his mind is racing. From that defining moment, Marco studies Elle's every shadow. He tracks the midnight phone calls. He watches the sister linger like a vulture. We must remember that blind loyalty is fragile, and it shatters the moment Marco watches the beautiful light finally die in Valentina's weary eyes. Here is the most heartbreaking frame of this tragedy. Valentina used to be the radiant warmth of this cold mansion, asking the armed guards about their children, smiling at the staff. Now, her lovely face is a terrifying porcelain mask. Marco knows exactly what he is witnessing. He is watching a desperate hostage, quietly assembling a bomb in the dark. He keeps his mouth shut, playing the loyal shadow to Enzo, but he feels the powder keg ticking beneath them. He is simply calculating who will survive the inevitable blast. Exactly 3 weeks after unearthing the sickening betrayal, Valentina begins to arrange her chess pieces. Hold on to this crucial lesson. True survival never begins with a loud, screaming match. It always takes root in the quietest, most invisible shifts in human behavior. She begins moving her belongings into the distant guest room, constructing an invisible, heavy wall. She cleverly blames the doctor, whispering that she needs to sleep alone to protect their unborn child. The bitter irony is that Enzo does not even blink. He views his wife's isolation as a lucky break, granting him freedom to pursue his sick affair with her sister. Soon after, she vanishes from his extravagant dinners, blaming her morning sickness. Whenever his hands reach for her, she violently shudders, burying her absolute disgust beneath apologies of nausea. Every calculated lie is another brick in the fortress around her broken heart. We learn here that silent patience is a lethal weapon. She studies him like a scientist watching a trapped rat, waiting for the exact moment he realizes his absolute power is completely slipping away. Men like Enzo Carbone cannot compute the loss of control. They are violently allergic to a woman stepping out of their shadow. He corners her in the dim kitchen, using his massive frame to trap her against the cold granite. He seizes her delicate arm, pressing down just hard enough to leave a threat, his dark tattoos shifting across tight muscle. "You have been distant," he growls. Valentina holds a deadpan expression, softly blaming the stress of the pregnancy. But Enzo senses the shift. He invades her breathing room, radiating that same dangerous energy that once made her fall deeply in love. But pause the scene and study her unblinking eyes. The lesson here is profound. Once the grand illusion of love shatters, all fear vanishes with it. All that remains in her hollow stare is pure, freezing disgust. "Tell me what is wrong," he demands, the air heavy with tension. Step inside her mind for a moment. Every fiber of her soul begs to scream the bloody truth into his arrogant face. She wants to shatter his ego, to demand exactly how many nights he spent in her sister's bed. She wants to know if his love was ever real. But she bites her tongue so violently she tastes copper. She denies him the satisfaction of her tears, knowing true revenge requires absolute silence to simmer. "I am just tired," she replies, her tone as dead as concrete. Enzo stares through her, his primal instincts screaming that she is lying, but he has zero proof. He slowly releases his grip, promising a reckoning soon. She walks away, feeling his burning paranoia. True strength is learning to swallow your righteous anger until the perfect moment to strike. Stay with me, because the twisted irony of this next scene is completely nauseating. The grand idea to host a massive family gathering actually flows from the lips of Chiara. The sister calls Valentina, her voice pitched into a sweet fake melody, chattering endlessly about bringing the syndicate together. Valentina stands frozen, listening to her own blood, relative babble over guest lists, fighting a violent wave of sickness. "That sounds lovely," Valentina forces out, her voice devoid of human warmth. Chiara cheerfully adds that Enzo has graciously cleared his weekend, promising to do all the cooking so her pregnant sister can rest. Valentina ends the call, staring blankly at the dark screen. The agonizing lesson of betrayal is that those who stab you in the back will always wear the brightest, most loving smiles to cover up their absolute filth. You and I have witnessed this arrogant, twisted game before, the deceitful husband and his treacherous accomplice orchestrating a lavish spectacle, entirely drunk on the thrill of their own deception. It is a pathetic display of vanity. Yet, as the hours bleed closer to Saturday evening, Valentina is not weeping into her silk pillows. She is meticulously sharpening her psychological blades in the dark. She utterly refuses to hand them the hysterical, weeping breakdown they expect from a broken wife. Instead, she will glide through the room as a silent phantom. She intends to study the secret glances they share, tracing the exact architecture of their sins, so she can bring the roof crashing down. The profound takeaway from her icy composure is this: absolute silence in the face of unforgivable betrayal is the most devastating weapon a human can ever forge. When the tragic evening finally arrives, Valentina stands perfectly still before her mirror, treating her wardrobe like a heavy suit of armor. She slips into a striking, blood-red dress that embraces her pregnancy while radiating an aura of total dominance. To the uneducated observer, she is the flawless, devoted wife of a kingpin. But within her mind, a violent war is raging. "You look stunning," a deep voice echoes. Valentina turns slowly to find Enzo leaning against the doorframe, draped in a tailored black suit, his collar unbuttoned to reveal dark gang scarring his throat. He traces her silhouette with a hungry, predatory gaze that makes her very soul recoil. She paints a tiny, polite smile onto her lips. Remember that keeping Grace under heavy fire is a rare superpower. "Thank you," she murmurs gently. "You should head down. The guests will be arriving soon." "They can wait," Enzo purrs, gliding across the floor like a shark scenting blood. He seizes her tightly by the waist, anchoring her in place before her body can flinch away. "I have missed you," he whispers, his tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. "I know the pregnancy has been difficult, but after tonight, everything changes. I promise." The sheer, sickening irony is almost too heavy to breathe. Does this arrogant man truly believe a lavish gathering will cure his poisoned soul? Can a glass of champagne wash away the absolute ruin of a marriage? "Of course," Valentina agrees softly, delivering a flawless performance. Enzo presses a condescending kiss to her forehead, a possessive brand to remind her who owns her. A fool always believes his own lies, never seeing the blade coming. 10 minutes, he orders into the quiet air. Do not keep our guests waiting. The camera glides through the suffocating opulence of the ballroom, settling on Valentina. She stands before a gilded mirror, her reflection drowning in the amber glow of 1,000 flickering candles. "After tonight, everything changes," she whispers, the words catching in her throat. The air is thick with the scent of dying orchids, a pathetic attempt to mask the stench of betrayal. Her sister Chiara orchestrated this entire spectacle. Men in bespoke suits circle the room like vultures, their polite handshakes masking lethal intentions. Valentina watches them, a phantom in her own dead marriage. She must play the perfect queen, even as the walls close in. We only realize how heavy the crown truly is, the exact moment we are forced to take it off. Notice how the director frames her isolation. She floats through a sea of empty conversations, forcing a polite nod as clueless wives offer empty advice about motherhood. But the camera pushes in on her eyes cold, calculating, tracking movement through the dim lighting. She watches Enzo across the room, his massive inked arms forcefully guiding a banker into a corner. Then, the focus shifts to Chiara, bathed in the blinding crimson fabric of her dress. Chiara laughs too loudly, desperately clinging to a guest, while her hungry eyes dart back to Enzo. She is starved for his dark validation. It is a pathetic, tragic dance. The most heartbreaking part of watching a betrayal is in seeing how deeply the traitor destroys themselves just to earn the villain's passing glance. Look closely at this frame with me, because this is where the tragedy becomes irreversible. Enzo and Chiara believe their sins are hidden in the shadows of the room, but hubris always demands a blood price. A smooth, quiet voice shatters the ambient noise. "Mrs. Carbone." Valentina turns to find a stranger bathed in cool, silvery light. He wears a tailored suit that whispers old money, his polite smile failing to reach his analytical, dead eyes. "Dante Moretti," he introduces himself, his hand extended. The name echoes like a death knell in her mind. Moretti means an ocean of blood, a pleasure she lies smoothly. You and I know how the real world works. The devil does not break down your door in the dead of night. He simply knocks, wearing a perfectly tailored suit. The camera lingers on her posture. Valentina has been drowning in Enzo's darkness for so long she has forgotten the simple rhythm of breathing. But Dante does not look at her as a possession. In the harsh light of the ballroom, his gaze offers a terrifyingly genuine recognition. It hits her chest like a blow, flushing her pale cheeks with sudden warmth. She struggles to maintain the rigid armor of a mob wife, but Dante gracefully slips a plain card into her trembling palm before vanishing into the crowd. A microscopic exchange, yet it shifts the tectonic plates of her existence. The bitterest truth of a lifelong cage is that a single drop of unexpected kindness is often enough to finally shatter the strongest iron bars holding you back. She is staring down at the card when the ambient temperature of the room seems to plummet. Enzo materializes from the shadows behind her, a predator sensing a shift in the wind. The lighting catches the rigid muscle of his jaw. He grabs her elbow with brutal precision, his fingers digging into her skin, a violent reminder of his ownership. He interrogates her with a venomous whisper. But instead of folding into the quiet victim she usually plays, Valentina holds her ground. The camera tightens on her face. For the first time, she stares back into the abyss of his eyes and defies him. He squeezes harder, his forehead shining with a paranoid, violent sweat. True liberation begins the exact second you understand that your supposed sanctuary is actually a slaughterhouse. This is where the tension reaches a beautiful, breaking point. A bitter, hollow laugh spills from her lips, cutting right through his Mafia kingpin illusion. Enzo panics, instinctively weaponizing her pregnancy, calling her hysterical to mask his own fading dominance. The camera zeroes in on the exact moment she stops buying his lies. With a sharp, sudden motion, she rips her bruised arm from his heavy grip. The chaotic noise of the party drops to a dead silence in her mind. Enzo is left standing under the chandelier, his mask of terrifying authority, slipping to reveal a small, frightened boy. The invisible chain between them is completely severed. The true face of a monster is always exposed the moment they realize they no longer hold any power over your soul. Watch the framing here as Valentina rushes the balcony doors. Her chest heaves with jagged breaths, completely blind to the shadow lingering just behind her. It is Chiara, lips curled into a quiet, satisfied sneer, pure envy, finally tasting victory. Stepping out into the biting cold, the shot shifts to Valentina's point of view. A pitch-black hedge maze stretches below, mirroring her own trapped mind. The sudden frost hits her skin, shocking her out of the panic. Notice how her fingers dig into the freezing stone railing, knuckles burning white. She anchors herself to that physical pain, while the illusion of her marriage turns to ash behind her. It is an agonizing image, but it leaves us with a necessary truth. You have to let a rotten house entirely collapse into dust before you can ever find the courage to rebuild. The moonlight casts Valentina in cold relief. You can physically see the shift in her posture. She isn't mourning a romance anymore. She is finally recognizing the heavy chains of a trauma bond. Out of the deep shadows steps Marco, the syndicate's massive enforcer. He plays the loyal guard, his voice a low rumble warning her to mask her tears. But keep your eyes locked on his face when she speaks the name Dante Moretti. The lens catches a tiny, involuntary twitch in Marco's jaw, a flash of pure dread in the eyes of a killer. The contrast is striking, reminding us of a very real human flaw. People who build lives on fear sleep peacefully with their own demons, but completely fall and separate the second an unpredictable element breaks into their carefully arranged world. Notice the blocking in this frame. As Valentina recounts Dante's mocking words, Marco refuses to cross the threshold. For a man built for violence, keeping that physical distance is a surprising act of empathy. He outlines the generations of spilled blood, realizing the breach was a test of their armor. Then she admits she kept Dante's number. Marco's voice instantly loses its bass. He orders her to toss it, but the panic is audible. Valentina fires back, chin raised, and the camera pulls sharp on Marco's eyes. He is looking at a fighter, no longer a helpless prop. It leaves us with a fascinating truth about human nature. Sometimes, the only flicker of genuine conscience in a house full of monsters is buried deep inside the man paid to do their worst. Marco recites the old syndicate script, trying to paint her silent suffering as loyalty. Instead, Valentina lets out a laugh that chills the entire scene. It is hollow and desperate. She verbally tears her husband apart, exposing a man who lights the match and complains about the smoke. Watch Marco here. He offers no defense. His silence fills the frame like a guilty plea, the mark of a man who watches the rot every day and bites his tongue. She stares down this towering killer and commands him to leave. He steps backward, shoulders slumped, and takes a post outside the door to block the wolves. It is a hard lesson to swallow. Sometimes the people, too, from the fire, will quietly stand guard outside while you dig your own way out. Stick with me here, because the irony is heavy. The syndicate muscle shows more mercy than her husband. Valentina is barely breathing when Chiara glides into the frame. Listen to the sugary pitch of her voice, the exact frequency of a traitor hiding a blade. Chiara parrots Enzo's gaslighting, stepping uncomfortably close. Then, the realization hits. You can see Valentina's eyes widen as the scent registers. The perfume. It is the exact sickening floral note that haunted Enzo's private study. The dark suspicion instantly crystallizes into cold, undeniable fact. Chiara even weaponizes the baby, just to twist the knife deeper. It exposes a tragedy as old as time. The most fatal wounds never come from your enemies. They are delivered by the exact people who share your blood. Valentina raises a shield of sarcasm, testing for a pulse in her sister's soul. Chiara just tilts her head, adopting the patronizing tone of a parent. She rewrites their history, painting Valentina as a shadow. Watch the chilling disconnect on screen. Chiara's fingers gently stroke Valentina's arm, a comforting gesture, while her mouth delivers absolute venom. She projects her own rot, accusing Valentina of stealing the life that belonged to her. The traitor confesses her guilt by aiming it at the victim. The camera lingers on Valentina's face as her heart finally breaks. The sister she loved never existed. It brings us to a brutal reality. Discovering your closest ally is actually a bitter, envious shell, brings a specific kind of grief that alters who you are forever. Look closely at this frame. The harsh light catches a tiny, cruel pull at the corner of Chiara's mouth. That is no ordinary sibling rivalry. That is the quiet thrill of someone who truly enjoys watching another person break apart like a cheap toy. Then the camera cuts to Valentina. The poor girl is completely frozen. You can almost feel the pure panic spiking in her chest. Her hands tremble as she tries to blame the spinning room on the alcohol, clutching at any excuse to keep her fragile world intact. It is a tragedy playing out in agonizing slow motion. But here is a simple lesson we all eventually learn. You cannot hide from reality forever. The truth just sits quietly in the shadows, letting you exhaust yourself, right until the moment you are too weak to fight. Watch closely how the camera lingers on Chiara here, because we are witnessing an absolute masterclass in emotional destruction. She delicately takes Valentina's most beautiful traits, her sweet innocence, her blind and total trust, and coldly flips them into fatal weaknesses. She is essentially whispering that Enzo belongs only to the stronger predator. And then comes the devastating kill shot. She drops the reality that this sickening affair began the exact day they lowered their father into the earth. It shatters the screen. But you and I both know this is not some random coincidence. The simple truth is, true predators do not hunt when you are standing open. They wait patiently until your soul is completely shattered by grief, because a broken heart is the easiest place for a monster to hide. Let the frame freeze and look at the twisted logic playing across Chiara's face. She stands in the dim light, framing this vile betrayal as if she were simply comforting a mourning husband. Desperate, Valentina plays her very last card, bringing up the child growing inside her, praying for a single spark of decency. Instead, Chiara's hand slithers out to touch the baby bump. It is a sickening display of dominance, claiming ownership over her sister's future while calling the betrayal delicious. When Valentina finally slaps that freezing hand away, Chiara's eyes practically light up with joy. It leaves us with a chilling realization. To a mind that deeply broken, completely destroying your own family is never a tragedy. It is simply the most exhilarating game in the world. Marco stepping into is the only thing keeping this ballroom from turning into a brutal crime scene. Valentina completely shuts down, her face turning to stone as she throws up an emotional fortress just to survive the long walk across the floor. Through the warm, hazy lights, she spots Enzo soaking up the absolute devotion of his mobster followers. But watch the micro-expressions on his face the second he sees her wandering. The fake warmth vanishes, replaced by raw panic. He grabs her waist, his fingers digging in just hard enough to remind her exactly who holds the leash. It is a terrible lesson we all must learn eventually. Realizing that the person you love sees you as nothing more than property is a bitter poison. But it is often the very first drop of the antidote. Let us strip down the layers of this scene together. Valentina attempts to stand her ground, looking this terrifying crime boss dead in the eyes, telling him not to play her for a fool. But her voice is completely hollow. Enzo instantly flips the script, his eyes turning to ice as he demands she repeat herself. It breaks her resolve, and she retreats to the guest room like a wounded bird. Now, focus on the sound design. The party fades. The house goes completely silent. Then, the heavy footsteps echoing down the dark hall. The metal handle rattles. It is a haunting reminder that the heaviest silence is never the absence of sound. It is the terrifying anticipation of the monster, about to break your door down. Notice how instantly the fragile illusion of safety evaporates in this shot. Enzo is not gently asking for permission to enter. He flat out promises to kick the heavy wooden door off its hinges. Men like him do not understand boundaries. They only see obstacles they are entitled to smash. She turns the lock. He steps into the dim room, his tailored jacket gone, revealing the dark ink that tells the true story of his violent nature. He traps her in the corner, his shadow entirely swallowing her, and accuses her of keeping secrets. The profound irony of his demanding honesty, while covered in her sister's scent, is suffocating. It proves a timeless truth. A man obsessed with total control will always project his own darkest sins onto the person he is terrified of losing. He paces the room, rattling off her changing habits like a weary detective reading a rap sheet. She will not touch him. She refuses to meet his gaze. Valentina tries to hide behind the safety of her unborn child one last time, but he brutally strips that defense away. He raises his voice, boasting about his own brilliance, demanding she spit out the truth. The projection is absolutely blinding. But look closely at the shift in Valentina's posture here. She lets out a bitter, exhausted laugh. This is the exact frame where the bleeding prey decides she is entirely done running. She takes his demand and turns it into a loaded weapon, asking about his late-night secrets. It is a beautiful lesson. There is nothing more dangerous to a tyrant than a heart that has finally run out of fear. With cold precision, she begins tearing down his carefully constructed alibis. The phantom phone calls, the endless late nights, and then she drops the absolute devastating truth right onto the floor between them. Her sister. For the first time in this tragic story, we see genuine, raw terror wash over the face of an untouchable kingpin. The blood completely drains from his cheeks. He tries to play the fool, but she paints the picture for him, his hands tangled in Chiara's hair, right there in his own study just 3 weeks ago. The silence that follows practically suffocates the room. As she demands to know exactly how long, you see his jaw lock tight. It is a stark reminder for all of us. A lie can build a towering fortress, but it only takes one agonizing truth to bring it crashing down. 6 months, 180 days of smiling warmly across the dinner table, while systematically tearing her universe apart in the shadows. The camera stays fixed on Valentina as the timeline clicks into place. This nightmare began the exact afternoon they lowered her beloved father into the dirt. When Enzo quietly confirms it, the physical impact is visceral. Her legs simply give out. She collapses onto the mattress, her hands instantly flying to protect the innocent life growing inside her, weeping that he violated her world with her own blood. And his response? He tries to minimize the damage, claiming it meant nothing. It teaches us a brutal reality. The deepest, most fatal wounds are never dealt by our enemies, but by the hands we trusted to hold us when we were falling apart. She throws her trembling hand out, drawing an invisible but absolute line on the hardwood floor, forbidding him from taking even one step closer. Sensing the total loss of control, Enzo wildly pivots. He abandons the hardened mobster persona and begins to plead, attempting to paint himself as the desperate, misunderstood victim. but the fog has fully lifted from her eyes. She cuts through his performance with razor-sharp sarcasm, asking if he truly expects her to fold back into the shape of a blind, obedient wife. He frantically swears the affair ended tonight, a desperate spin for redemption. You and I know exactly what this is. Apologies born strictly from the panic of getting caught are never about true regret. They are just a masterclass in manipulation and trying to salvage a broken toy. When pushed into a corner, the narcissist always falls back on the exact same predictable script. Watch how rapidly the frantic panic melts away, instantly replaced by a dead, calculating stare. He realizes that every tool in his arsenal, the endless money, the intimidation, the silver-tongued promises, is completely useless against a woman whose heart has already been burned to the ground. It is tragic, yet fascinating, to watch a man who dictates life and death in the underworld realize he has absolutely zero power inside his own bedroom. He puffs his chest, projecting authority, but the illusion is dead. It is a profound lesson. True power is never found in the chains you place on others, because the moment they stop fearing the pain, your entire empire is already finished. Let us sit with this deeply emotional turning point. Valentina looks at this monster through her tears and states clearly that she and her baby are not just assets on his bloody ledger. That single sentence completely shatters his twisted fantasy of ownership. She reclaims her shattered dignity and orders him out. Stripped of his perfect doll, Enzo slips his cold psychopathic mask back into place, whispering a promise to make her pay. The instant the door clicks shut, her adrenaline crashes. She sinks to the floor sobbing, the toxic grief bleeding out of her soul. She is still a prisoner in this sprawling mansion, but she has won the night. Sometimes, that is the most magnificent display of human courage. Simply to keep breathing in the dark until you can finally find your way to the light. Take a slow, hard look at the sheer geography of Valentina's gilded cage. The father who protected her is resting in the ground. Her own flesh and blood has become the architect of her pain. Every single person walking the halls of this estate answers to the devil she married. But watch what happens to the warden when the prisoner stops caring. Enzo begins to spiral into a complete narcissistic collapse. He cancels his underworld meetings, pacing the marble floors like a rabid, paranoid guard dog. The cinematic tension is unbearable as he sits across the sprawling breakfast table, his eyes hollow and dead, quietly pointing out that she has not touched a single bite of food. It teaches us that a cage made of solid gold is still a prison, and the absolute most dangerous hour is when the monster finally wakes up. Pause the film right here and look closely at the heavy ink crawling up his throat. It is a permanent, visible receipt for all the brutality he attempts to hide beneath those tailored silk suits. We are witnessing a silent, agonizing tug of war. By refusing to eat, she starves him of the single thing he craves, the most, her utter submission. In a moment of pure desperation, he uses the life of their unborn baby as leverage. When he slams the delicate porcelain cup onto the table, it is nothing but raw panic spilling over. He begs her to talk about the weather, to pretend the rot has not consumed their marriage. His voice literally cracks. It is a timeless truth laid bare. You can conquer cities and force 1,000 men to their knees, but all the power on earth cannot force a human heart to love you back. Look closely at Valentina's face. You and I are going to unpack this tragedy together. The man holding her prisoner, the architect of her absolute ruin, is completely losing his mind, his hands that have ruthlessly destroyed. Countless lives are reaching out, practically begging for some magical clean slate. But she sits there, a perfect sculpture of ice. She does not even glance at the wedding ring. Instead, she casually drops a bomb, mentioning a simple lunch invitation from Chiara. In a fraction of a second, his desperate pleading vanishes, and the terrifying monster snaps right back into focus. It is a chilling reminder. Sometimes, the absolute quiet reaction is the most devastating weapon against those who try to break your spirit. You have to hold your breath watching this, because she is dancing on the edge of a cliff. She challenges him directly, a move that is essentially a death wish with a man of his violent nature. He immediately twists the story, painting her sister as the ultimate villain, while completely erasing his own 6 months of brutal betrayal. The mental gymnastics are staggering. Valentina stares at him, leaving her food entirely untouched. She knows the foundation of this marriage is nothing but ashes. Then she delivers the final blow. She threatens to walk out and take his unborn heir with her if he tightens his leash, even an inch. She is gambling with her very survival. But sometimes in life, you have to risk losing absolutely everything, just to discover how much power you truly hold. He throws a dark, heavy threat across the table, but he does not follow her out the door. That is a monumental shift in the balance of power. Valentina heads directly to the meeting. Chiara, paranoid and calculating, has chosen a bright, crowded plaza, so he cannot simply drag them away into the shadows. But the second Valentina sits down, Chiara launches her attack. She cruelly mocks her sister's appearance, ordering a drink just to parade her own freedom. Chiara sits there, entirely full of herself, waiting for the waiters to turn their backs so she can dig for fresh wounds. It is a heartbreaking reality to witness. Sometimes, the people who share your blood are the very first ones, waiting in the shadows to strike when you are already bleeding out. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Chiara leans in, starving for every tragic, broken detail. She fully expects Valentina to be a sobbing, shattered mess, and she has absolutely no idea how to handle this dead, hollow stare. Chiara desperately tries to dress up her toxic betrayal as some kind of genuine sisterly concern, and it is honestly sickening to watch. She knows exactly how this violent underworld operates, and her advice is just to roll over. She wants Valentina to be the perfect hostage wife and enjoy her expensive prison. But here is the brutal truth she fails to grasp: selling your soul for the safety of a comfortable cage never actually keeps you safe. It only guarantees that you will remain a prisoner for the rest of your days. Chiara drops her terrifying warning as casually as if she were discussing the afternoon weather. She knows the waters are filled with blood. But when Valentina presses her on why she did it, Chiara practically smiles, claiming she was just looking for a cheap thrill. That is when Valentina plays her final card. She calmly announces that the affair is already over. The camera lingers as Chiara's ego shatters into 1,000 jagged pieces. Valentina surgically dismantles her, explaining that Chiara was nothing but a fleeting distraction for a deeply bored sociopath. When the walls finally closed in, the monster protected his actual prize, his wife. It is a harsh truth. If you build your own happiness on someone else's destruction, it will eventually collapse right on top of you. You can see the precise second the panic takes hold. Chiara flushes red, and then every drop of blood drains from her face. Her grand illusion is completely dead. Valentina forces her to look at the cold, hard facts, the absolute silence on his end, the way he vanished without a trace. That silence is the only proof Chiara needs to know she was entirely played. Valentina slowly stands up, towering over the table. She leans in and delivers a promise of ruin. So cold, it freezes the air in her lungs. She is wielding the exact same ruthless tactics she learned from her monster of a husband. Only when she walks out into the street does her whole body begin to shake. The lesson here is simple. You can wear the toughest armor imaginable, but underneath it all, we still bleed. We have to stop and ask ourselves, why is she shaking so violently? Is she terrified of the monster she is becoming, or is she addicted to the sudden rush of power? The scene cuts to the stark white lights of the doctor's office. Dr. Ferretti is no ordinary physician. She stitches up cartel hitmen in the dead of night. But looking at Valentina's charts, even her professional mask completely slips. The physical toll of this living nightmare is flashing across the monitor. Her heart rate is spiking out of control. The doctor knows this extreme stress is a ticking time bomb for the unborn child. It is a devastating truth. You simply cannot outrun your environment. The heavy, toxic stress we carry in our minds will always find a way to break our bodies down. Stick with me, because this conversation is crucial. Valentina instantly throws up her walls, lying through her teeth that everything is perfectly fine. Dr. Ferretti confirms the baby is safe for now, but her eyes lock onto Valentina's crumbling mental state. The doctor tries to break the heavy armor, offering a tiny, fragile sliver of hope. But then she makes a catastrophic mistake. She actually tries to justify the mob boss' insane, violent behavior. She admits he is a monster, but she dares to call his twisted obsession love. That is the most dangerous trap in the entire world. Mistaking absolute control and possession for genuine affection is exactly how people end up trapped in the dark. True love is supposed to heal your wounds, never hold you hostage. Look at the way her eyes are glued to that glowing ultrasound monitor. That tiny, fluttering heartbeat is the only pure thing left in her entire world. It is a blank slate, totally untouched by the venom of its parents. But Valentina knows the bitter reality. No amount of desperate, twisted affection can ever erase the fact that he burned her trust to the ground. She walks out of that clinic, holding the only proof of life that matters to her, and immediately collides with the architect of her nightmare in the hallway. He actually freezes. His hands twitch to hold her, but he forces himself to stop. She just stares straight through him and repeats the lie that she is fine. Sometimes, the biggest lies we tell are just to survive the next 5 minutes with the ones who broke us. Fast forward to that silent night in the dimly lit nursery. The room is only half finished, much like the ruins of their shared life. He stands by the window, staring out into the pitch-black darkness. His paranoia runs so deep that he hears her footsteps before she even speaks. Out of nowhere, he starts rambling about his dark legacy and his terrifying fear of just fading away. Valentina stays firmly by the door, keeping a clear path to run if the air turns violent. She asks him the ultimate question: was she ever anything more than a fancy incubator? He finally turns around, the cold mask completely gone. He admits she was the only soul who ever saw him as human. It is wildly tragic. The people who demand the absolute most loyalty are often the first ones to tear it to pieces. The psychology in this moment is absolutely staggering. She demands to know why he chose to ruin their entire existence. His answer is tragic, pure, unfiltered terror of actually needing another human being. A man like him operates on absolute control, and her slipping past his heavy iron gates felt like a weakness he simply could not stomach. So, he dragged her own sister into the darkness to blow it all up. He genuinely believed he could cheat physically while keeping his precious marriage perfectly safe in a box. Now he is reaching out, drowning in an ocean of regret, realizing his massive ego destroyed the only real light he had. Here is a lesson to remember. When you spend your entire life building walls to keep the pain out, you eventually lock yourself inside with it. Let us step into this final frame together, you and I. We are witnessing a painful masterclass in toxic loyalty. She is staring dead into the eyes of the man who burned her entire life to the ground. Those dark, jagged tattoos on his neck look exactly like the permanent scars he carved into her soul. He gazes at her with this manufactured desperate agony, and she tells him flatly that their trust is dead. He nods, playing the part of the wounded, understanding lover. But when his hand gently brushes her cheek, the pain in her chest flares up like wildfire. He whispers that he cannot survive without her. Trauma is a vicious, ugly trap. It literally rewires your brain, making you crave warmth and comfort from the exact same monster who is slowly tearing you apart piece by piece. The camera lingers on her frozen frame. Instead of running, Valentina turns entirely to stone, under the cold light of the nursery. His hand brushes her cheek, a calculated stroke designed to pin her to the floorboards. Enzo does not ask for forgiveness. Predators of his nature do not know the word. He begs for a trial period, offering a grand, hollow illusion. He whispers he will abandon his dark empire, his wealth, even the unborn child, if she asks. It is the frantic dance of a wolf caught in a snare. The silence stretches, suffocating and heavy, broken only by her trembling breath. When she finally asks why he needs more time, the tragedy seals itself. She just handed the executioner his axe. A quiet lesson we must learn sometimes. Talking to the monster is exactly what locks the cage. Let us pause on this frame, because you and I must witness the tragic comedy unfolding in the shadows. Valentina steps back, raising trembling hands to build a boundary, as if sheer willpower could hold back a hurricane. Enzo plays the devoted, obedient servant. He retreats into the dim lighting, fully aware that a king must sometimes kneel to win the war. She threatens to burn it all down if he touches her sister, Chiara. He dismisses the threat with a chilling wave of his hand. She leaves him standing alone among the unpainted cribs and the ghosts of a life they will never have. Weeks drag on in suffocating silence, and he obeys her every rule. But remember this bitter truth. My friends, you can never build a wall high enough when the devil is already sleeping inside your house. He demands absolutely nothing, surviving on the cold scraps of her shadow cast across the hallway. The simple rhythm of her breathing sustains his dark hunger. But this isolation is a beautifully lit cinematic lie. He is a ghost haunting every corner. When midnight nausea hits, his hands are there, holding her hair back in the moonlight, playing the tragic hero. He weeps when the child kicks against his palm. When rival families close in, he sits outside her door in the pitch black, a loyal hound guarding his prize. The suffocating warmth slowly melts her defenses, frame by frame. Marco watches this sickness take root and pulls her into the dying autumn garden to shatter the illusion. The saddest truth of human nature is that the deadliest poison often tastes exactly like salvation. The lens shifts to Marco, his face carved with exhausted lines under the fading sun. He is the sole soul completely immune to this psychological warfare. He warns Valentina she is growing weak, willingly stepping back into the jaws of the trap. She snaps back, asking why he even bothers to care. Marco simply collapses onto the stone bench, the weight of 20 years of cleaning up bloodbaths settling on his shoulders. What terrifies Marco most is how this monster loves. It is not true affection. It is a bottomless, consuming void. Marco locks eyes with her, admitting the guilt is real, but the obsession is entirely fatal. We must understand that a predator may weep for the pain he causes, but he will never, ever unlock the heavy iron doors of your cage. Marco delivers the brutal truth with the precision of a surgeon. He asks how she expects to build a home upon a rotting foundation of pure obsession. Valentina crumbles, her hands covering her face as she weeps, confessing the lines between love and madness have entirely blurred. Marco rises, blocking out the sun, and drops the final hammer. He urges her to strike before Chiara finishes the job. The blood drains from Valentina's face. Her sister is out there, aggressively selling their lives to the underworld. Chiara has transformed into a reckless, vindictive force of ruin. Marco leaves her alone among the dead roses, clutching her unborn child in pure dread. It is a cruel reminder that our hardest choices are never between good and evil, but between two guaranteed disasters. Watch closely with me as the twisted psychology of this trauma bond plays out in the shadows. Instead of fearing for her own life, Valentina is consumed with terror for the man keeping her chained. The midnight quiet shatters when her phone vibrates, flashing a blocked number. Every primal instinct screams to let it ring, but fear forces her hand. The smooth voice on the line belongs to the apex predator himself, Dante Moretti. Valentina stops breathing. Demanding to know how he bypassed security, Dante speaks with terrifying elegance, claiming he is simply offering a professional courtesy. A professional courtesy. Her reckless sister is about to burn their kingdom down. It proves that no matter how deep you bury your past, your unresolved sins will always hunt you down in the dark. Dante lowers his tone to a chilling purr, ensuring she feels the invisible strings he pulls from miles away. He paints the picture Chiara is eagerly trading their lives away. Valentina's chest heaves, her hand gripping the edge of the nightstand as she begs for details. Dante casually lists the devastating secrets Chiara is handing over, enough to hollow out the empire from within. Why would a rival offer this mercy? Dante claims a love for the rules, but the cinematic truth is darker. He knows her husband is a powder keg. If Chiara's greed gets Valentina hurt, Enzo will drown the city in blood, and Dante refuses to burn with it. He commands her to meet him alone. The irony is agonizing. The only shield protecting her from the outside wolves is her abuser's psychotic devotion. The screen remains bathed in the sleepless, suffocating blue of the early hours. Any rational soul would expose the sister's treason, but Valentina is so deeply fractured by betrayal that she shoulders this crushing weight in absolute silence. This is the masterpiece of abuse. It isolates you until you believe you are the only one left in the world. The next afternoon, she steps into the dim, smoke-filled air of a private club. Dante sits in the corner, a portrait of absolute dominance. He rises slowly, his dark eyes tracking her movements like a scientist examining a doomed specimen. He openly mocks her, astounded that she actually answered his summons. It is a gut-wrenching scene. When the world breaks your spirit, quiet surrender simply becomes your tragic, automatic response. Valentina locks onto his hollow gaze, ignoring the porcelain cup slid across the table. She demands the unvarnished truth. Dante leans forward, painting a masterpiece of familial treason. For 3 long weeks, her own flesh and blood has been mapping the exact coordinates of Enzo's downfall. Chiara's ultimate prize is to raid the vaults the second the king loses his crown. Dante outlines the chilling psychology the moment Valentina and the child vanish. Enzo will shatter into jagged pieces. Dante tilts his head, shadows catching his cheekbones, and asks what her next move will be. She crumbles into the leather seat, confessing she is too broken to move. He offers zero comfort. The universe will never pause its brutal turning just because your legs are too weak to walk. You and I must take a moment to study the terrifying intellect of this man. Dante is clinically dissecting the anatomy of a monster. He reveals that Chiara did not merely sell shipping routes. She sold the rotting core of their marriage. She weaponized the child, turning a husband's manic obsession into a ticking time bomb. The blood leaves Valentina's face. She asks why a broken heart matters to the Mafia. Dante's reply is a razor-sharp truth. A chaotic boss is dangerous, but a king consumed by a single queen is predictable. She is the fatal flaw. She desperately argues she is just a woman, not a weapon. He coldly corrects her. A blade is only as dangerous as the hand wielding it. We must always remember, the deepest love can quickly become our most lethal vulnerability. Dante signals the waiter with a slight gesture, closing the curtain on this tragedy, as if they had merely discussed the rain. He confesses he will not strike, because the ensuing bloodbath would simply cost too much. So why drag her here? He wears the mask of a businessman, but the camera catches a fleeting shadow of genuine mourning in his eyes. He knows the freezing agony of a knife twisted by family. It is a specific poison that permanently rewires the human soul. Valentina rises, her chair scraping violently, declaring she owes him nothing. Dante stands with terrifying grace, offering an exit her husband would never permit. She walks out into the blinding light, but the poison is in her ear. Sometimes, the devil sitting across the table understands your sorrow better than the angels at home. The very frame she steps across the threshold, Enzo's patient facade violently snaps. He stands silhouetted against the grand window, his features twisted into pure paranoid rage. The puppeteer has lost his favorite strings. He stalks forward, demanding her exact coordinates. When she offers a trembling half-truth, he closes the distance in a blur, stopping a hair's breadth from her face. The heavy ink on his throat pulses with frantic heartbeats. He snarls at her to stop lying, admitting Marco tracked her every move. His tone drops into a fragile, terrifying whisper, begging her to say she did not betray him. But Valentina anchors her feet. With ice crystallizing in her veins, she looks directly into his hollow eyes and speaks Dante's name. No matter how deep you bury it, the brutal truth always kicks down the door. Let's frame this shot together. The room goes absolutely dead. The silence so heavy, it pulls the air right out of your lungs. We hold the camera on Enzo. You watch the circuits in his mind snap, first terror, then rage, before freezing into a hollow grief. Valentina stands her ground under the harsh lighting. She confesses she met the enemy, just to measure the true depths of her sister's malice. Echoing every dark word Dante fed her, Enzo sheds no tears. He just empties out, shifting as the monster inside reclaims him. He stares at the floorboards, whispering he should have buried Kyra on day one. Here is the brutal truth of the scene. A predator's nature will always suffocate his promises. The lesson is simple. You cannot save someone from the poison they refuse to stop drinking. Pause the film right here and study the composition. Look at Valentina. She just told Enzo she is not his sister anymore, every word laced with quiet venom. And how does Enzo react? He opens the classic narcissist playbook. The camera pushes in as he forces tears, swearing he only confessed to protect their unborn child from Chiara's twisted jealousy. It is almost beautiful how flawlessly he plays the victim. Valentina stares right through him, bluntly stating she does not trust a single breath he takes. But look down at the frame, look at her feet. They remain planted. She does not walk out that door. The tragic irony of this Greek tragedy is suffocating. The very person who shatters your world suddenly becomes the only shelter you want to hide in. Life teaches us this painful paradox. Unhealed trauma will always convince you to embrace the blade that just cut you. Watch his hands carefully in this next sequence. Enzo reaches out to touch her, then lets his fingers hover before pulling back. It is a brilliant, calculated move by the actor, forcing her to cross that physical boundary herself. He softly praises her for coming home, crowning her the patron saint of forgiveness. But then the sharp buzz of a phone shatters the score. A text from Chiara lights up the screen, showing a stalker photo of Valentina at the club, threatening to burn their lives down. The camera catches Enzo reading it right over her trembling shoulder. Instantly, the grieving husband routine dies. The warm lighting seems to turn cold on his face. You can literally see the Mafia boss resurrecting in his dark eyes. It teaches a chilling truth about human nature. A predator only plays tame until he realizes another wolf is circling his cage. Valentina whispers into the shadows, "Let her come." It echoes like a classic cinematic line of defiance. But if you look at the slight tremble in her jaw, the truth is clear. She is drowning, desperately grabbing the wheel of a sinking ship just to feel some illusion of control. Enzo does not even blink. He sheds the weeping husband's skin and steps fully into the role of a warlord. The director cuts forward a few hours. The lavish, sunlit mansion is now a suffocating bunker. The civilian staff is gone, linked by heavily armed men pacing the perimeter. And where do we find our tragic heroine? Isolated in the dim library, her hands protectively gripping her swollen stomach like a lifeline. When your entire universe is turning to ash, the human mind instinctively clings to the one pure thing left, just to keep the darkness from swallowing you whole. Notice the costume design in this frame. Every thread tells a story. Enzo leans against the heavy oak doorframe, his sleeves rolled up, exposing the dark, heavy ink mapping his forearms. The soft sweaters are gone. He is advertising exactly what he is, an apex killer. He quietly orders her to eat, a subtle tactic to re-establish dominance, but she refuses to bend. Look at the blocking here. He stays across the room, deliberately maintaining a cold, physical distance. He waves off Chiara's threats as desperate noise, assuring her the rival bloodline will not intervene. Enzo understands the mechanics of panic better than anyone. He knows that if you refuse to give fear any oxygen, the fire has no choice but to starve. It is a hard life lesson we all eventually face. Sometimes the only way to defeat chaos is to deny it your reaction. Let us pause and unpack this scene together. You and I. Why is Enzo so absolutely certain the rival faction will hold their fire? The script reveals he already cut a cold, bloodless deal with Dante off camera. War simply ruins the bottom line. But watch the tension spike as Enzo slowly crosses the room, shrinking the physical space between them, and drops the heaviest line of the act. Does she want her sister dead? The ambient sound drops to zero. Right here, Valentina is forced to stare the devil in the face. She tied her life to a man who treats human breathing like a math equation he can erase at will. By refusing to sanction her sister's execution, she is fighting a desperate, quiet war. for her own morality. In the end, preserving your soul often means refusing to play the game by the monster's rules, even when it costs you everything. It is genuinely agonizing to watch this unfold. Valentina begins to ramble, her voice cracking as she talks about braiding hair and weeping together at their mother's grave. She is retreating into the sepia tones of the past because her present reality is too grotesque to witness. Enzo absorbs this with eyes like flat, dead stones. He finally delivers the ruling. Chiara will survive, but she is exiled forever. Then, lingering by the heavy door, his armor fractures. He tells her he is genuinely trying to be a better man for her and the child. The deepest tragedy, he actually believes his own lie. But true evolution does not happen just because you suddenly locate a moral compass. We only change when we are absolutely terrified of losing the one fragile, beautiful thing we finally managed to hold on to. Watch her face in this close-up. Just like that, the hard lines of Valentina's rage begin to dissolve into a sick, twisted hope. This is the dark magic of the trauma bond in full effect, painting a masterpiece of self-deception. The director cuts to the following dawn, the lighting a bruised slate gray, matching her internal world. The estate is a fortified tomb. Armed sentries block every exit, deadbolts lock tight. But Enzo? He is a ghost. Valentina storms into the glowing monitors of the security room, demanding answers. Marco refuses to break eye contact, playing the dutiful soldier. He sells her the comfortable lie that this cage is built purely out of love. It is a cautionary tale we see off-screen too often. Control is always wrapped in the velvet language of protection, and isolation is always sold to you as a bodyguard. But the dynamic shifts right here. Valentina is completely finished, playing the fragile, kept woman. The camera angles low, empowering her as she raises her voice, demanding agency over her own existence. Marco starts sweating under the harsh fluorescent lights, trapped between a lethal boss and the boss's wife, and his resolve shatters. He confesses that Enzo took a heavily armed strike team straight to Chiara's door. He hastily throws in the word non-lethal, a pathetic attempt to put a bandage over a gaping wound. Then, Marco delivers the fatal blow. He stares right at her and whispers that everything Enzo does today is for her. See the psychological trap? He is forcing her to wear the heavy, bloody coat of Enzo's violence. It teaches us a brutal truth. Toxic people will always try to make you the excuse for their own darkest sins. Marco methodically lays out the syndicate's version of mercy. They hand Chiara a duffel bag of cash and put her on a train to nowhere. But the silence beneath his words screams the real consequence. If she resists, they will put her in the dirt. Stick with me through this pivot, because this is the exact frame where Valentina's denial shatters. She can no longer pretend she did not willingly marry a shark, and now she is horrified by the sight of blood in the water. Against every piece of logical advice, she demands to see her sister one last time, brushing past Marco's desperate warnings. It defies reason, does it not? But human nature is tragically stubborn. Sometimes we have to walk straight into the burning wreckage of our most painful relationships, just to force our own hearts to accept that they are truly gone. The cinematographer deserves an award for this sequence. The setting is a hollowed-out, freezing concrete warehouse, a perfect physical mirror of the dead space between these two women. Valentina steps out of the shadows, flanked by men holding automatic weapons. Notice how she pulls her heavy wool coat tight across her stomach, turning herself into a human shield. In the dead center of the room, trapped beneath a single, unforgiving spotlight, sits Chiara. Her expensive silk dress is torn, mascara cutting dark tracks down her pale cheeks, but her arrogance remains totally unbroken. She immediately goes on the attack, spitting venom, mocking Valentina for finally growing claws. It is a pathetic, tragic portrait. Even while bleeding out on the floor, a true narcissist will still demand that you admire the way they hold the knife. Valentina just stands there, her voice breaking as she asks the simplest, heaviest question. Why? She is desperately digging for logic in a graveyard, trying to understand how her own blood could orchestrate her ruin. Chiara leans into the light, and unloads a lifetime of rotting, bitter poison. She crafts this elaborate tragedy of being the invisible second child, forced to watch Valentina effortlessly gather the handsome husband, the wealth, the family. To Chiara's twisted mind, these were not blessings, they were stolen trophies. Valentina pleads back, crying that she never even wanted this dark, violent life. But the camera lingers on Chiara's cold smirk, showing the futility of it all. The harsh reality of life? You can never negotiate with madness, and you cannot reason with someone who treats their victimhood like a religion. The scene descends even further into the dark. Chiara practically spits out decades of festering jealousy, her face twisting as she admits it. Slowly killed her that their own mother loved Valentina more. And when Enzo walked in and chose the older sister, it pushed her over the edge. This is a bottomless, tragic pit of insecurity. Watch Valentina's eyes in this shot. She completely stops searching for an apology. You can pinpoint the exact frame her soul turns to frost, realizing how fundamentally broken Huster's mind is. She asks, voice dead flat, if that was the only reason she slept with Enzo. Chiara does not even blink. She smiles. She did it simply to prove she could shatter Valentina's perfect porcelain life. It was never a story of forbidden love. It was just a hollow, vindictive grab for power in a game only she was playing. Chiara leans forward, shamelessly confessing that pulling the city's most lethal predator into her bed was like mainlining pure adrenaline. Destroying her sister's sanctuary was the only thing that made her feel tall. The ambient audio drops out completely. The silence in that cavernous space becomes physically suffocating. But pay close attention to Valentina's blocking. She does not scream. She does not strike her. She simply walks closer, staring down at the stranger wearing her sister's face. She whispers that Chiara used to be her only safe harbor in a terrifying world. Chiara struck the match, not out of righteous anger, but because she could not tolerate the sight of someone else's happiness. It leaves us with a devastating truth. Some people will happily burn down your entire house, just so they can finally be the ones to feel warm. Pause the film right here for our final frame, guys. Look at this masterful shift in dynamics. Valentina's voice drops to a chilling absolute zero. She now holds the literal power of life and death in her hands. And as she looms over the chair, pure terror finally splinters Chiara's arrogant mask. But Valentina does not give the execution order. Not out of weakness, but to honor the ghost of the little girl who once chased away her nightmares. She tosses the heavy stack of bills onto Chiara's lap and issues a final decree. Vanish. If she ever returns, Valentina will unleash her monster of a husband without a hint of remorse. And here is the tragic, ultimate lesson we take from the screen. Sometimes, protecting your own spirit means you have to bury someone while they are still standing right in front of you. Let us open this scene up together and truly examine the wreckage in this frame. The camera lingers on Valentina, staring at the sister she helped twist into a monster, realizing exile is a colder punishment than a bullet. Outside, in the bleak lighting, Enzo waits. Watch him closely. To the underworld, he is a god of absolute terror. But the second his eyes meet his wife, the harsh shadows on his face soften. The armor falls, and right there is the most terrifying weapon a narcissist possesses: selective vulnerability. He asks if she is all right, wrapping her in a fake blanket of empathy just to test how much of her shattered mind he still owns. The lesson here is simple. The sharpest traps in life never look like iron cages. They look like open arms, waiting to catch you. Was she actually all right? The lighting shifts, casting shadows over her face, as her reality burns to ashes. Her sister is gone, her marriage rests on lies, and her concept of love is stitched together by trauma. She whispers no, but promises to fall back in line. The camera pushes in as Enzo opens the car door, his fingers lightly brushing the small of her back. It is a calculated movement designed to remind her she needs him. She does not even flinch. The drive back to their sprawling estate is suffocatingly silent. It is not the angry quiet from before, but the heavy, tragic stillness of two broken people realizing they are chained together. It teaches us a grim truth. Sometimes we cling desperately to the exact thing that shattered us, simply because it is the only thing we know. Follow the camera into the grand, freezing foyer of their mansion. Enzo plays the dutiful husband, softly mentioning he must clean up the bloody aftermath of their violence. Just watch the absolute tragedy in Valentina's eyes. He broke her mind, sparing her sister only to ensure Valentina owes him her life. Then, out of nowhere, she mentions finishing the baby's nursery. The tonal pivot gives you whiplash. Enzo freezes, completely stunned, his hardened face suddenly illuminated by a fragile, desperate joy. It is a masterclass from a narcissist, using the pure image of family to drag his victim right back into the honeymoon phase. If this tragic scene leaves you with one lesson, let it be this. Hope can become the most lethal, toxic drug in the world when it is gently handed to you by the exact person who poisoned your soul. Enzo accepts this delicate truce with a quiet, burning intensity. The lighting catches the sheer exhaustion on Valentina's face. She lays it out plainly. This does not mean trust. She is simply too tired of sleeping, with one eye open, bracing for his next betrayal. When she admits she wants to try again, it completely shatters the heart. Stepping back into his golden cage feels infinitely safer than facing the terrifying freedom of the unknown. Notice Enzo's body language. His hand literally trembles in the air, waiting for permission to touch her. When she finally leans into his palm, a visible shockwave rolls through her. This heartbreaking frame reminds us of a hard truth. When you are starving for genuine love, even the smallest crumb of action can make you entirely blind to the absolute disaster staring you in the face. The second his skin meets hers, months of crushing grief and emotional starvation melt into the shadows. Her body craves comfort so desperately that it silences every alarm bell ringing in her head. Enzo softly swears he will spend the rest of his life earning her surrender. She closes the heavy bedroom door before her resolve completely crumbles. That night, her battered mind finally allows a dreamless sleep. The camera treats us to a montage, seasons bleeding from spring into summer as they play house in this cavernous estate. They paint the nursery together in soft colors, wrapping themselves in a shared tragic delusion. But the bitter lesson of this beautiful lie remains clear. You can paint over a rotting wall with all the bright colors you desire, but the deep decay is still going to bring the entire house crashing down eventually. You and I must pause the film here and look at how perfectly they decorate this gorgeous trap. They bring in an antique crib, hanging a delicate mobile that chimes a haunting old lullaby. These are just pretty props, meticulously placed to make a twisted reality look normal. The towering wall between monster and hostage begins to crack. She has not forgiven him, her soul is still bleeding. Yet, she slips into that dangerous survival mode, known as cautious hope. We watch them spend quiet mornings trading dark childhood trauma over black coffee. He uses his abusive father to justify his sins, while she whispers about being the forgotten daughter. It paints a devastating picture for us all. Shared pain might feel like a profound connection, but building your foundation on broken glass will always leave your feet bleeding. Stick with me here, because we are watching exactly how a trauma bond sets like hardened concrete. The cinematography captures Valentina desperately trying to turn this nightmare into a home. We see tiny, deliberate touches, her hand resting on his lower back, her fingers straightening his dark collar. To an outsider, they are a couple healing. In truth, it is pure, desperate survival. The scene shifts to his dimly lit study. She whispers that the baby is kicking, asking if he wants to feel it. Enzo freezes, completely unmoored, asking if she is sure. She is desperately poking the monster in the dark, begging to find 1 ounce of humanity, to prove she is not insane for staying. The brutal lesson here is written in blood. Never test a poisonous snake just to see if it has a heart. A snake only knows how to strike. Just watch the brilliant execution of this absolute maniac. Enzo approaches her like a wounded animal terrified of spooking its prey and drops straight to his knees. A ruthless king who commands a criminal empire is bowing before his pregnant wife. The second his heavy tattooed hands feel that tiny kick, the icy mask shatters. He looks entirely raw and destroyed. He whispers, "It is their child," weeping that he deserves neither of them. It is the ultimate psychological manipulation, weaponizing his own self-hatred to reel in her endless empathy. Valentina, fully submerged in Stockholm Syndrome, strokes his hair and promises they will try for all three of them. He presses his face to her stomach and sobs. It leaves us with a haunting truth. The most dangerous tears you will ever wipe away are the ones cried by the person who ruined you. Let us zoom in and deeply analyze her reaction. She never pushes him away. She absorbs his tears, praying to the heavens that this shattered shell of a man can somehow become a father. But then, the script violently flips. At 28 weeks pregnant, the shrill ring of his private phone cuts through the silence. The physical shift in Enzo is terrifying. His face drains of color, the thick veins beneath his neck tattoos pulse, and his body floods with violent adrenaline. He hangs up, and she demands the truth. His jaw locks like a steel trap as he drops her sister's name. It hits Valentina like a physical blow. Chiara is alive, and she is selling them out to the rival family. The tragic irony of this moment proves the hardest lesson of all. The past never stays quietly buried if it already knows exactly where you live. In one brutal frame, the illusion of their safety shatters into dust. Enzo's voice is dead as he reveals Chiara leaked the biggest secret of all. The camera catches the panic, rising in Valentina's chest as she realizes they know. About the hospital, about the unborn baby. The floor completely falls out from under her. She begs to know why her own blood would betray her like this. Enzo's eyes go pitch black, explaining the rival cartel wants leverage, and a mob boss heir is worth its weight in gold. His hands tremble with homicidal rage. He screams he should have put a bullet in Chiara when he had the chance, smashing his fists against the mahogany desk. It is a terrifying display that echoes a brutal reality. When you show mercy to a scorpion, you cannot be surprised when it comes back to sting your child. You and I are going to watch this scene unfold and witness the ultimate narcissistic spin. Enzo completely spirals, making this crisis entirely about his own bruised ego. He screams that his betrayal made her sister hate them enough to sell out their unborn child. Now watch Valentina's blocking. Her twisted survival instincts take over, and she steps directly toward the ticking bomb. She gently rewrites the narrative to stroke his pride, whispering that the poison belonged to Chiara, not him. She locks her desperate eyes with his, anchoring him. Slowly, his manic screaming fades into the dead, hollow stare of a predator plotting a bloody war. It is a sobering, tragic lesson. When you spend your entire existence managing a monster's emotions, you completely forget how to protect your own weary soul. His grand solution to this tragedy is to lock her away completely. The script leans into the classic abuser playbook here, absolute isolation. He declares they are going off the grid until the baby arrives. When she asks about his vast criminal empire, he knows exactly which strings to pull. He grabs her face, his thumbs pressing into her cheeks, and swears the money, the power, and the blood do not matter. He whispers that only she and the baby exist to him. Now, to her deeply battered mind, this dark isolation feels exactly like true romance. They pack under the cover of darkness and flee to a heavily guarded mountain fortress. Life teaches us this painful truth very early. When someone builds a giant wall to protect you from the rest of the world, they are usually just building a prison they can quietly control. Look closely at this frame with me, because it establishes the entire tragedy. The camera follows them up a series of winding mountain roads, the headlights slicing through pitch-black woods. In the back seat, Enzo grips Valentina a hand, with a knuckled intensity, his eyes scanning every passing shadow for a sniper. When the tires finally crunch over the gravel, Valentina inhales the sharp scent of pine, desperate for peace. Enzo stares up at the massive stone fortress, and the armor cracks. He whispers that his grandmother brought him here, the only soul who saw a boy instead of a weapon. The heartbreaking truth of life is that even the most ruthless monsters are merely chasing the fading ghosts of those who once loved them. Let the camera linger in the pale, ghostly moonlight pouring through the glass. The sheer isolation of this villa is a psychological pressure cooker. The cool light highlights the brutal geography of his scarred skin as she quietly demands the truth. He turns slowly, the heavy silence stretching, and confesses he's exhausted from the hiding. And then, the devastating blow lands. His voice cracks as he tells Valentina he loves her, that he has loved her since the beginning. For a battered spirit, those words trigger a chemical rush, violently rewriting her shattered reality. It is a deeply brutal lesson of human nature. If you starve someone of basic kindness for long enough, they will eventually mistake a single crumb of affection for a lavish feast. Watch the slight tremble of his fingers as he reaches into the frame. She challenges his sudden confession, reminding him of his past silence. His defense is the suffocating shadow of death, whispering that he was a coward terrified they would not survive the night. He gently brushes his thumb across her cheek, wiping away silver tears she did not realize were falling. The horrific tragedy is that Valentina is staring into the eyes of her destroyer, watching him carefully rebuild the very soul he tore apart. She drops her gaze, admitting she cannot say the words in return. He accepts this softly, murmuring he only needs her to feel it. The quiet truth of life is that while pure love never demands a reward, the most powerful manipulators always know how to patiently play the long game. The tension in the room is suffocating, broken only by her ragged breathing. She whispers into the dark that she believed her love was a corpse, buried by his own violent hands. He closes the distance, pressing his forehead firmly against hers. A cinematic portrait of overwhelming dominance. A healthy person would flee the frame, but Valentina, reshaped by captivity, tilts her chin upward and meets his lips. It begins as a hesitant exploration between two ruined souls before erupting into pure combustion. Months of suppressed rage and terror ignite into a feral hunger. They cling to each other like sailors drowning in a pitch-black ocean. The harsh reality of life is that when basic survival becomes braided with dark passion, the resulting inferno burns away your entire identity. They break apart, the camera capturing the frantic rising of their shoulders. She commands him to take her to bed, her voice shaking. In a quiet display of manipulation, he pauses, questioning her certainty, dropping the emotional weight back onto his victim. She replies by pressing his palm against her pregnant stomach, surrendering to the tragic illusion. He leads her to the bedroom, kneeling to light a roaring fire. Warm shadows dance across his back, illuminating the brutal tattoos she once feared. When he turns around, his expression is entirely stripped of its cruel armor. The deep lesson here is that a monster's genuine vulnerability in vulnerability is far more terrifying than their rage, because it forces you to confront the painfully broken human hiding beneath the violence. The cruel facade shatters, revealing a desperately fractured man. He offers a hollow illusion of choice, whispering that he only wants to hold her. She tears that boundary down, her trembling fingers undoing his shirt. She confesses she is drowning in suffocating hostility and needs to feel something real. As the fabric falls, the camera pans across a gruesome canvas of his violent history. Faded ink and jagged scar tissue map out a lifetime of trauma. She gently traces a raised white line, and this king of violence shudders beneath her soft touch. She whispers, asking if the old wounds still ache. The tragic truth of life is that love cannot magically heal someone simply by tracing the very scars they use to terrorize the outside world. You and I must recognize the fatal psychological trap closing in this very scene. We often mistake the horrifying damage of a broken person for proof of emotional depth. He murmurs that his scars no longer ache, framing them as monuments to the monster he was forced to become. He presses her hand against his chest, forcing her to feel his frantic heartbeat, claiming this is the man he wishes to be. They shed every final defense, collapsing into raw, desperate intimacy. Later, draped in shadows, he traces her shoulder with religious reverence, whispering how much he missed her. She notes she never physically left. The lesson is undeniable. Mere physical proximity means absolutely nothing when the emotional bridge between two souls has been meticulously burned to ash. The frame tightens, capturing the moment this psychological prison locks forever. He buries his face in her collarbone, confessing the agony of her emotional distance. In a devastating move, she pulls the architect of her misery closer, whispering that she felt the tether even through her hatred. The cinematography shifts. Their union is slow and deliberate, a dark bond built over a graveyard of mutual wreckage. Afterward, they lie tangled in the bruised darkness, his scarred hand moving in endless circles across her stomach as he dreams aloud of their unborn daughter. The ultimate tragedy of life is that the most dangerous emotional houses are the ones we construct upon the ruins of our own trauma, simply because the ES feel like home. We watch them project an impossible salvation onto this unborn child. Valentina smiles into the dark, joking their daughter will carry her defiance. A genuine laugh escapes her, and you can see the crushing weight of captivity release from her shoulders. Then, the tragic peak of her conditioning emerges. She looks into his eyes and whispers that she loves him, a reflex of a profoundly broken mind. She admits she loves his potential, clinging to a gentle phantom, existing only in her fractured imagination. Enzo goes completely still, struck silent by the magnitude of his psychological victory. The grim lesson here is that falling in love with a toxic person's potential is merely a poetic way of destroying your heart over a ghost that never actually existed. The camera captures a startling reversal. He confesses his paralyzing terror of losing her, his voice trembling. Her delicate fingers trace the harsh black ink on his neck, a glaring symbol of his ruthless underworld. Right before our eyes, she begins to rationalize her own abuse, whispering that they are both greater than their darkest sins. This exposes a devastating flaw in human nature. We will blind ourselves to an entire history of calculated terror just to bask in a single second of fabricated warmth. As she absolves him, the undisputed king of violence shatters into tears. Instantly, the ruined victim transforms into the soothing caretaker. She cradles this weeping, apex predator against her chest, silently vowing to mend the very architect who burned her life to the ground. The gates of their toxic dependency lock, shut forever. For a fleeting window, the villa becomes a stage, where they play a tragic pantomime of normal life. The director frames them in a sunlit kitchen, laughing over ruined meals to drown out the deafening reality of their existence. With her pregnancy swelling, they stroll along the stone battlements, pretending to be ordinary lovers looking toward a bright horizon. But the tragedy always demands its due. When she asks about returning to the city, the illusion shatters. Enzo's jaw tightens, his eyes deadening back into the cold stare of a warlord. He casually reveals a dark pact with a rival syndicate to eliminate their enemies. The cruel truth is inescapable. No matter how perfectly you decorate a temporary sanctuary, you can never outrun the bloody chessboard of consequences you left behind in the real world. She questions the sanity of this dark alliance. Stick with me, and let us look at this frame together, because it perfectly illustrates how fast a captive relies on their warden. Enzo S. faces stone as he states he trusts nothing but mutual self-interest. The heartbreaking turn? Valentina does not fight back. Drained by months of psychological warfare, she simply collapses against his chest. He whispers a calculated apology, but watch her chilling response. She no longer demands his redemption. She only begs him to keep them alive through the coming slaughter. She has handed over her soul, pointing her greatest threat as her ultimate shield. The brutal reality of life is that paralyzing fear will always convince you to trade your precious freedom for the comfortable illusion of safety. Step into the cold shadows of the villa. The illusion of control shatters 3 weeks early. Valentina wakes in the pitch black, a massive surge of pain overriding every rational thought. Her body forces labor at 36 weeks. Enzo jolts awake, adrenaline rushing through his veins. She grips his hand, her fingernails digging deep enough to bruise bone. Subordinates scatter, screaming for a transport chopper. Enzo cradles her pale face in the dim light, speaking low, rhythmic Italian to tether her heartbeat. Life teaches us a brutal truth here. In our most agonizing moments of survival, we will desperately cling to the most familiar voice in the room, even if it belongs to the monster who built our cage. You and I can feel the suffocating tension in this room. The helicopter is 20 minutes out, but the hospital is a 2-hour flight. Biology refuses to wait. Dr. Ferretti bursts through the heavy oak doors, his sharp authority cutting through the chaos as he banishes the gunman. What follows is a grueling, 6-hour physical nightmare, painted in sweat and agony. Valentina endures the visceral trial of childbirth, in complete isolation. Through every breathless second, Enzo remains anchored to her side. His steady baritone becomes the only rope keeping her fragile mind from slipping into the dark. It is a strange, profound lesson. Sometimes, the exact person who shattered your reality becomes the only force strong enough to hold you together when the walls cave in. The sharp wail of a newborn pierces the heavy air, and the lighting in the room seems to shift. They lay this fragile, breathing miracle right against Valentina's trembling chest. In a standard film, the camera would fade to black on a happy ending. But this is a tragedy. This tiny girl is the living seal on a massive, unbreakable trauma bond. Look closely at Enzo. The hardened, ruthless mobster is weeping silent tears, his armor melting away as he stares into the reflection of his own soul. It brings us to a quiet realization. Even in the absolute darkest, most shattered places a human heart can reach, new life still finds a way to take root and bloom. Yet the tragic irony remains that same beautiful life just bolted the doors of their shared nightmare forever. Valentina names her Sophia, a word meaning wisdom. Her voice shakes, betraying how desperately she clings to the fantasy of a quiet life. Enzo offers a slow, reverent nod, and for 5 fleeting seconds, we almost believe they can outrun their sins. Then, the harsh vibration of a phone shatters the illusion. It is a message from her sister, Chiara, laced with venom, and promising to put the infant in the dirt. The fairy tale instantly bleeds out. The desperate helicopter flight to the city transforms into pure, suffocating paranoia. Valentina curls over her child like a physical shield. It forces us to swallow a bitter pill. No matter how thick you build the walls of your denial, your past will always find a crack to crawl through and collect its debts. Watch Enzo closely during this turbulent flight. The loving father mask shatters to reveal the cold, calculated predator beneath. He lifts the phone to his ear, his voice a flat, dead void. He orders his men to drag Chiara in breathing, strictly forbidding a quick death. He needs the tactile satisfaction of breaking her spirit with his bare hands. Then, in a single breath, he hangs up, gently stroking her cheek like a devoted saint. It makes the blood run cold when a man can pivot from orchestrating absolute ruin to whispering tender promises in 3 seconds. It reveals a chilling truth. Sometimes, the fierce top protector standing between you and the monsters is simply the most terrifying monster in the room. You and I need to pause the frame right here. This is the exact moment Valentina's soul turns to ash. Enzo states he will execute Chiara. A year ago, she would have begged for mercy, but now, with a newborn pressed to her heart, the primal drive to protect her blood burns her ethics to the ground. She stares into her husband's eyes and whispers the words that authorize a murder, crossing a line drawn in permanent ink. Enzo stares back, a twisted pride illuminating his features. They lock themselves inside their fortress, masquerading as a normal family. It is a harsh lesson we all eventually learn. We all believe we are good people, right up until we finally have something to lose. The massive estate now feels exactly like a tomb. Armed men guard every shadow, and security lenses track every breath. The air is suffocating. Little Sophia sleeps peacefully in her crib, blind to the fact that her nursery is the epicenter of a war zone. Valentina drifts through the echoing halls, a ghost trapped in the fog of postpartum shock. But Enzo is putting on a terrifying masterclass in duality. 1 minute he is mapping out a merciless, city-wide manhunt to drag a woman into the light, and the very next, he is warming a bottle and singing a soft lullaby to his daughter. It highlights an unsettling truth about human nature. A man can be an absolute nightmare to the rest of the world while desperately fighting to be a hero inside his own home. Valentina watches him cradle the infant, the dim light catching the weary hope in her eyes. She whispers how stunned she is by his change, desperate to believe the maniac she married is gone. For a heartbeat, the untouchable crime boss looks genuinely vulnerable. He silently begs her to believe in his redemption. She leans closer, betting her entire existence on the fragile hope that this is not another psychological trap. He swears to spend his remaining years, proving her forgiveness was not a mistake. They share a delicate smile, pretending the wolves are not circling outside. Yet life offers a cruel, heavy lesson about trust. You can apply all the fresh paint you want to a rusty sheet machine, but eventually, the toxic corrosion is going to bleed right through. The fragile domestic bubble violently bursts when a guard steps into the frame. They finally caught Kiara. She is dragged into a cold, concrete basement, heavy metal cuffs binding her like a rabid animal. The woman is hollowed out, her hair matted, and eyes sunken from weeks of terror. Yet, even looking like a bruised ghost, Kiara spits venom, hurling vile insults at Valentina's motherhood. The visual contrast is staggering. Valentina stands in the grim interrogation room, watching her own sister hit rock bottom while holding a sleeping newborn against her chest. It forces us to swallow a bitter reality. When you attempt to fight blinding darkness with even more darkness, nobody walks away clean. And the concept of genuine closure is just a comforting lie we tell ourselves. You and I must unpack the deep rot in this family tree. Kiara screams against her chains, putting on a tragic performance. She genuinely believes she is the innocent victim here. She viciously accuses Valentina of stealing their parents' love, the golden life, and worst of all, stealing Enzo. She glares at the mob boss, who watches her with absolute ice in his veins. Kiara cries out that their father promised her the criminal empire, that she was destined to be queen. Valentina does not flinch. She simply goes numb to the madness, turning her gaze to her husband for the final truth. It offers a heavy truth about human frailty. Some people will violently rewrite their entire personal history just so they never have to look in the mirror and admit they were wrong. Valentina looks her husband dead in the eye, demanding the absolute truth. Enzo remains perfectly still, the dark calculus shifting behind his eyes. When he speaks, his tone is terrifyingly serene. He admits the patriarch offered him either sister, bargaining their lives like luxury vehicles. He chose Valentina intentionally. With surgical precision, he breaks Kiara down, telling her she was too loud, too desperate, and entirely too easy to manipulate. He steps close to his wife, declaring that her quiet, unbreakable strength was the exact foundation his empire required. Hearing this, Kiara shatters into a million pieces. It leaves us with a timeless truth. True, undeniable power never actually has to shout to prove it belongs at the head of the table. The tension in the room reaches a boiling point. Kiara thrashes against her chains, the horrific reality of her fate finally bleeding into her eyes. She stares at Enzo, seeing the cold-blooded monster before her, and asks if he is going to end her life. Enzo gives a slow, relaxed nod, showing the effortless calm of an apex predator. But in a brilliant cinematic pivot, Valentina steps into the line of fire. She looks at this toxic sister who threatened her child and slams on the brakes. She commands the crime boss to stand down. She calmly explains that burying her sister will not magically erase the trauma woven into their shared past. The lesson here is profound. Destroying the exact person who broke you never actually rebuilds the fragile pieces of yourself they took away. Why does she stay the executioner's hand? She refuses to let her daughter grow up under the shadow of a father who slaughters his own blood. Enzo warns that Kiara will never stop hunting them, but Valentina delivers a sentence more devastating than a bullet. She condemns her sister to permanent solitary confinement, locking her in a silent box to slowly lose her mind. Chiara spits at her feet, mocking her as too weak to pull the trigger. Valentina's gaze is colder than a winter grave. She whispers that measured restraint, choosing calculated mercy over basic revenge, is what absolute power looks like. She turns to Enzo, issuing the command just to see if the wild wolf will finally heal. Remember this. True discipline is having the strength to let the heavy sword remain quietly in its sheath. The camera lingers on the unthinkable, the untouchable kingpin actually bends. He relinquishes his iron grip, issuing a quiet command to banish Chiara to a frozen, maximum security cell in Sweden for the rest of her days. As her desperate screams fade down the marble corridor, the physical weight crushing Valentina's spine visibly lifts. 6 months bleed past, and the lens opens on a transformed estate. The suffocating tension and armed guards have vanished. Instead, the bright, innocent laughter of a baby echoes through the sunlit halls, breathing a fragile warmth into the cold stone. Enzo and Valentina have quietly renewed their vows in the shadows, yet the framing leaves us with a quiet truth. You can build a beautiful new home over a graveyard, but the earth will always remember what lies buried beneath. Let us pause the frame right here. Notice the quiet of the room, no cameras, no massive Mafia spectacle to feed a fragile ego. They strip the illusion down to the bone. It is just 2 fractured souls standing before a few witnesses, trying to reset a poisoned dynamic. Enzo speaks his vows in a low whisper, sliding a new ring onto her finger as a promise to end the lies. Valentina holds his gaze, demanding he never lock her out again. But the camera does not lie to us. A betrayal of that magnitude leaves a permanent scar. Valentina still flinches at shadows, haunted by the phantom pain of the life he broke. Yet, they do not run away. The hardest lesson we learn in love is endurance. They choose to sit in the messy ruins, painstakingly rebuilding trust, one exhausting day at a time. Watch the lighting in this next shot. Valentina slips like a ghost into the dimly lit nursery, burying her face against her infant, just to remember how to draw a breath. The child coos, and you watch the rigid terror melt from her spine. Then, Enzo appears in the doorway, swallowed by shadows. The visual contrast here is pure tragedy, the sharp, immaculate cut of his dark suit pressing against the violent ink, creeping up his throat. His voice is a heavy rasp as he confesses. The crying did not wake him, because his eyes never closed. He crosses the room, wrapping his arms around his family like a human shield. Sometimes, love is just pure terror. In the dead of night, his mind endlessly calculates the razor-thin margin by which he almost lost his entire world. It paralyzes him. Look closely, said his eyes in this scene. The untouchable kingpin looks at the woman he broke and softly admits he owes her his life. His brow furrows in genuine disbelief that she stayed, knowing anyone with sense would have vanished into the night. But Valentina stands as cold and still as marble. She strips away his romantic illusion, making it explicitly clear she did not stay for his soul. She stayed for their child, to prove that a shattered father could be glued back together. She stares down the predator, who tore her mind to pieces, granting him grace for doing the brutal work of changing. We do not need our loved ones to be flawless. We just need them to keep trying. Right before the weight of the moment crushes them both, the baby babbles, shattering the dark tension. Enzo forces a crooked smile, joking that their child inherited her fierce fire straight from her mother. Valentina lets out a sudden laugh, and the sound is thick with genuine relief. The camera tracks them onto a balcony, surrounded by iron gates and guards. It looks like an impenetrable fortress. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. Bullets cannot pierce those thick walls, yet a fragile piece of paper slipped right through the armor. Valentina quietly reveals that Chiara smuggled a desperate letter out of the psychiatric ward. It is the classic plea of a broken narcissist begging for absolution. When Enzo tenses, asking what she did, Valentina offers a chilling smile. True power is refusing to engage with toxic ghosts. She gave her the cruelest punishment of all, absolute silence. You and I can almost feel the weight of that folded paper in her trembling hand. It is a psychological trap. Forgiving her abuser feels impossible. But clutching onto that burning hatred is like drinking poison and waiting for the enemy to choke. It slowly rots the soul. This is the exact moment Enzo proves his change. He does not charge in to violently fix the problem. He simply stands at her shoulder, a quiet mountain of support, vowing to back whatever choice she makes. Valentina exhales, realizing the lonely war against her demons is finally over. The sky above them bleeds into a bruised, tragic violet. We jump forward a few years, and the peace fractures. Their daughter, Sophia, is old enough to ask dangerous questions, forcing Valentina to translate their waking nightmare. Watch the careful restraint in her body language. She sits at the edge of the bed, softly tucking the blankets around her child, trying to turn a history of Mafia blood and psychological torture into a gentle bedtime story. She whispers about a dark season when Mommy and Daddy simply lost their way. The innocent girl, kept completely ignorant of the violence that shields her, smiles and says they fixed it. Valentina strokes her daughter's hair, her eyes heavy with a profound life lesson. She explains that healing is never a magic trick. It is a grueling, exhausting choice you must wake up and make every single morning. She tells her little girl that life brings impossible pain, but she carries the thick blood of survivors who never ever back away from the burning flames. Valentina lingers by the door, staring at a purely innocent child who cannot fathom the ocean of blood it took to create her. She steps out into the dim hallway, finding Enzo positioned like a loyal, silent sentry in the shadows. She immediately reaches for his large hand, her fingers tracing the jagged, violent scars on his knuckle to ground her racing heart. When she whispers that Sophia is asking the hard questions, the camera captures Enzo stiffening. He slips right back into a cold, tactical mindset, demanding to know how much truth escaped. But then, the terrifying mob boss shatters. His broad shoulders slump, and a broken man quietly asks the question tearing at his soul. He desperately needs to know if she regrets staying to build a life on his ruined foundation. She holds the gaze of the man who once destroyed her, speaking with a fierce certainty. She tells him she does not regret a single piece of the life they dragged from the ashes. A dark, weary smile touches Enzo's lips as he vows that the monster he once was is deep in the ground. Stick with me here, because the director makes a brilliant choice. They walk down a corridor lined with perfectly staged family portraits, sunlit vacations, gentle smiles. It is a beautifully curated ghost story of a normal life. Suddenly, Valentina stops. Enzo pulls her flush against his chest, dropping the last shred of his lethal persona. A man can only run from his sins for so long. His rough voice fractures, choking on tears as he thanks her for a grace he never earned, swearing his life is hers. She presses her palm flat against his chest, anchoring herself to the heavy, steady thud of his heart. She whispers that his agonizing, relentless effort to change is the only reason she did not walk away. Pause the film one last time with me. Just look at the frame. They stand in the center of an absolute empire, and every single marble tile was cemented with the blood of their shared trauma. She rises onto her toes, gently kissing the lips of the architect who orchestrated her nightmare. It is a tragic, beautiful portrait of survival. If there is one stark lesson to pull from the wreckage, it is this: you cannot magically wash away the violence done to your soul. True resilience is finding the agonizing strength to build a beautiful house over a dark graveyard of broken glass. In the dark theater of the human mind, we rarely dare to use a word like love. Consider Vittorio and Luca. The audience sees an unbreakable bond of devotion, but the camera reveals the cold shell of a psychological hostage situation. Vittorio's betrayal was never a simple business move. It was a sadistic god running a cruel stress test, pushing his subject to the breaking point just to watch him crawl back. The profound tragedy is that Luca mistakes his trauma for righteous loyalty. He will wake up tomorrow and blindly kneel before the exact man who ruined him, mistaking his heavy chains for destiny. The life lesson here leaves a bitter taste. The most inescapable prisons are never made of iron. They are forged by our desperate urge to seek safety in the hands that drowned us.
Enzo's regret becomes one of the most complicated parts of the story. After Valentina confronts him, he admits the affair, ends things with Chiara, and begins trying to repair what he destroyed. He shows remorse, holds back from Valentina without permission, supports her during pregnancy, and asks for time, becomes the man he should have been. But the story wisely does not present forgiveness as something instant or easy. Valentina does not simply turn to him because he cries, apologizes, or claims to love her. She tells him clearly that she does not trust him and may never trust him again. This creates a strong educational lesson. Forgiveness should never be demanded from the person who was hurt. It must be earned through accountability, patience, and changed behavior. Enzo's pain may be real, but his pain does not erase the pain he caused. His explanation that he was afraid of needing Valentina gives the soul story emotional depth, but it does not excuse his betrayal. Many people use insecurity, fear, or trauma as a reason for hurting others. The mature lesson is that explanations can help us understand harm, but they do not remove responsibility. Valentina's decision to give him time is meaningful because it is her choice, not his right. And she sets conventions, no expectations, no contact with Chiara, no assumption that the marriage is fixed. This is what healthy accountability requires. The person who broke trust must accept discomfort without rushing the healing process. The injured person must be allowed to move slowly. And the story teaches viewers that reconciliation is possible only when truth is faced completely. Forgiveness without accountability just becomes another wound. But accountability, if proven over time, can become the first fragile step toward rebuilding.